She thumps a cane and drinks champagne. She's formidable and judgmental, but we can guarantee that she's a quintessential Lady D, who recognizes great potential. What would Danbury do?
Welcome to What Would Danbury Do, a podcast about the Bridgerton series from A to V. It's time for another bonus episode. This time, we're talking virginity, and more specifically, virginity loss. Back at uni, I studied virginity discourses a little, so you're kinda gonna have to forgive me while I soapbox, but I swear that this is important and relevant. So a couple of notes. For the purposes of the interview you are about to hear, we're predominantly focusing on heterosexual female virginity. And by extension, we are defining virginity loss as PIV sex, or penis in vagina sex. It's kind of funny how often people assume they know what virginity and virginity loss is, but whether you consider virginity a gift or a burden, the fact is, like many things, virginity is a social construct and can be defined, lost, and even reacquired in many ways. But that's kind of a lot to get into when in reality, Bridgerton, both the books and the series, is largely concerned with that heterosexual PIV female virginity loss. So that's what we've focused on. Next, Dr. Jodie McAllister is our guest today, and to say she's incredible is an understatement. Scholar, lecturer, young adult author, and most importantly, our friend. And I think it's fair to say that Jodie has basically written the book on virginity loss. So we're really excited that we can bring her to you. Don't forget, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as @BridgertonPod and Instagram as @WWDDPod. Join the conversation using the hashtag WWDDPod.
I am Dr. Jodie McAllister. I'm a lecturer in writing, literature and culture at Deakin University in Melbourne, and I wrote my PhD on virginity loss.
And I think the great thing also about you, Jodes, is you are fully enmeshed in pop culture.
Oh yeah, I regularly introduce myself as the trashiest academic in all the land. And that's using the word trash in the sense that I can say it, but I get mad when other people do.
Yeah. So what is virginity?
Yeah, it sounds like it's an easy question, like what's virginity? But it's really, really complicated. The virgin is a floating signifier. She's a moving target. It changes according to the needs of society at the time, and that society is almost always a patriarchy. And I'm going to talk about female virginity here, but we should note that there's other stuff going on with male virginity. So what that has meant and what that has stood for has transformed hugely over the course of history. If we go to ancient Greece, virginity typically stood for kind of the promise of fertility. It was imbued with kind of a really active sexuality. We move into other periods in history and the virgin becomes austere and asexual and passionless and associated with things like silence. Virginity has been a source of power in the church in particular. A lot of nuns used the kind of what we call perpetual virginity of nunhood. Is that a word? Of being a nun to claim a voice, because they were like, oh, well, I'm not beholden to a man. There's no man between me and God, so I can speak. The church reacts by like implementing a discourse that's like, oh no, nuns are the brides of Christ now. You have to shut up. But virginity has been tied up with economics for a long time. Like a daughter's virginity is valued. The virginity is more valuable than the woman in many cases. And that's something that we do see play out in Bridgerton, where like Daphne's virginity and her even more so than her actual virginity, her reputation for being virginal is something she has to guard at all costs. If we talk about the 21st century, the way we define virginity now is we typically tend to think of it as a physical thing rather than an intellectual or a spiritual thing. Even then, what it is, there's no medical definition of virginity. Like people try and tie it to things like the hymen, but many women break their hymens doing things like horseback riding, or I don't know, riding a bike, walking down the street. Hymens aren't very strong, and many people are born without hymens. And then what happens if you are queer and you lose your virginity in a non-penis in vagina penetrative sex experience. Virginity is becoming increasingly irrelevant, but one of the trademarks of virginity is that it never becomes more visible than in the moments before it is lost. So take things back to the 19th century, along with the physical aspect of virginity, you very much have this social and reputational aspect tied to this notion of purity. And a lot of this is anxiety over lineage. If you marry a virgin, you know any children that she has will be yours. So it has been a tool used to put women in particular boxes for a very long time.
So, like, where does Daphne's virginity loss sit in your work?
Okay, so I was writing about the book. So I wrote a little bit about that very funny but also very horrifying scene where Violet tries to have the sex talk with her. And interestingly, like, that highlights a couple of things. One, which is a thread that's picked up in the series and I think treated with much more gravity there in a way that I really appreciated and think they could have done more with, was her complete lack of sexual education and how ill-equipped she was, you know, just kind of going out into the world and doing things. Because if the most dangerous thing to you is compromise, which is compromise of your virginity or at least your virginal reputation, but you don't know what that means, even you don't know what that threat looks like, how that manifests, like, Jesus Christ, that's so dangerous. And it's played for laughs in the Quinn, and like, it is a funny scene because Violet is so awkward and doesn't know what's up, and Daphne's like very thirsty for the information. There's this line where, you know, Daphne's like, yes, I'm gonna find it out at last, and she's like very excited to find out what it means, but there's like an element of thirst there too.
Book Daphne and series Daphne are different creatures. I will say, having seen having read the book, and I think that scene is hilarious, and watching it is a completely different experience for me because I get really, really angry.
Yeah, and when it's paired, especially with there's I think it's episode 2 with Penelope and Eloise just being so, they're like, okay, where do babies come from? Can we catch it from eating cake? Like, there's something, again, it's funny, but it's also so dark. But yeah, stepping away from that kind of sex education angle, if we look at the scene itself, it's indicative of a lot of what was happening in historical romance at that time, and I think still at this time, which is we use historical romance to endorse what we think modern love looks like now. It's a communicative scene and it's a consensual scene, and Daphne does it right. She becomes what I call in my book, The Consummate Virgin, the consummate virgin. So I argue in my book that someone becomes the consummate virgin after they've lost their virginity. It's an identity that you embody retrospectively when you've lost your virginity in the right way. And so Daphne loses her virginity by the terms of her society in the right way. It's after marriage and it's with someone that she loves. And the argument I make in my book is that what constitutes right has become increasingly confusing and nebulous for people over the course of the 20th and the 21st century. Instead of marriage, we now typically use love as like, this is when it's okay for girls to have sex, but like, how do you know whether you're in love with someone? But Daphne becomes the consummate virgin. She does it right. And in this way, historical romance, I think, employs what's called by the scholar of science fiction, Darko Suvin, cognitive estrangement, where we can recognize aspects of our own world better because we're experiencing them via a world that's in a remove. If we think back to about 10 years ago, there was a tendency to think about romance fiction, particularly romance fiction coming out of North America, that kind of starts with The Flame and the Flower. That's a whole problematic trajectory, but that's a whole different argument. But there was a tendency to divide it into old school and new school. So there were, old school books that were like the scare quotes bodice rippers. This is your Flame and the Flower, your sweet savage love. And
that's also like the forced seduction terminology. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. Though it was rape. It was straight up rape. Like if you read The Flame and the Flower, the heroine, Heather, people try and rape her 5 times in the first chapter, and she gets raped several times in the first chapter, but it's framed as a rape. Like, it's not framed as a seduction at all. So I think sometimes even that term forced seduction is a little bit glamorous. But anyway, getting back to what I was saying, there was a tendency to have this kind of bright line between old school and new school romances. And Julia Quinn was very much in the new school when we thought about it then. So not particularly rapey, which is kind of ironic, much more sex positive, much more sort of friendly towards the female reader in many ways. But one of the biggest evolutions in criticism of romance over, I think, the last 10 years, but particularly in the last 5 years, is we're really starting to problematize that bright line between the old school and the new school and seeing it much more as a continuum. And Bridgerton has really become kind of a flashpoint for this, because we're talking about it so much now. We spend a lot of time thinking about it as part of this modern school of romance, but when we think about 20 years ago, the leaps that we've made societally in discussions of sex and consent and things like race and gender and sexuality have been enormous. And if that book was written now, I think it would be, if that book exactly came out now, we would have a very different reaction to it. If that book was written now, I think it would be a different book. It wouldn't be the same book at all, which I think is one of the most interesting things about historical romance. It always reflects the context in which it was written as much as, if not more so, than the time in which it's set. In kind of the 2000s, very much we were using the historical framework to endorse narratives of modern love now. And what that proves is that the way we think about love and we think about sex now is true and right and ahistorical. And yeah, this is a really nerdy history argument. I'll stop talking about it now. There's like 50 more layers.
In 10 years' time, we're going to be looking back on this discussion and be like, oh, young Jodes, young Adele.
Yeah.
Like, you were so...
Sweet summer children.
No one seems to know where the hymen is, Jodie. Why is that?
Basically, the more obvious a hymen is, the kind of stereotypical iron hymen, the more obvious it is when virginity is taken, virginity is lost, because this is an anxiety that runs through a lot of literature by men about female virginity, is this idea that the female body isn't readable, that they don't know whether someone's fooling them into thinking they're a virgin when really they're not. So often in text, they make a woman's body absurdly readable, in that they'll be like, you know, I think it's fairly normal for women losing their virginity in a like PIV sense to experience some pain, but in like some particularly like 18th and 19th century literature, you've got women like screaming and yelling and fainting, and then there's blood everywhere, and there's a real anxiety over the readability of a woman's body, this idea that they really want virginity to be written on a woman's body and whether you have it or not to be immediately obvious, and it is just not the case. So like virginity testing is still a practice in some places around the world, and it's bullshit because you straight up can't tell. Like, it's not something that is written on a woman's body.
So I guess we have this virginity loss. They have feelings for each other. There's no love declaration, which typically happens in a lot of romance books.
There is a declaration, though. Like,
there is a hell of a declaration.
Well,
there's two declarations there. I burn for you, and there's also the declaration of like deep friendship and attraction and like connection in front of the queen as well. Yeah. But there is no "I love you."
There is no "I love you." But I think this is, again, kind of really interestingly indicative of using historical romance to endorse modern attitudes towards love, in that something that a narrative that arises, and I'm borrowing here from the scholar David Shumway, over the course of the 20th century is this idea of intimacy, of love of something as something that you work at, not just something you fall into and now you're in love, hooray, hurrah. Love, a relationship you've got to work on to make it work. And Shumway argues that the discourse of intimacy developed because we needed a way to tell the story of a marriage. And romance fiction we tend to think of happily ever afters and marriage as being very what's the word I'm looking for, as synonymous in a fairy tale sense, and that's something we see in a lot of 19th century fiction, but it's not what happens in 20th and 21st century historical romance. The marriage can happen very, very early in the book, and here we're in episode 5, so we're just over halfway. We need a way to tell the story of the marriage, we need a way to tell the story of the relationship, and so you need these declarations of intimacy, which, if not declarations of passionate love, are declarations of friendship and declarations of desire, and them putting the building blocks together to create something where they truly know each other.
We also actually have another virginity loss that happens off scene just before the series starts, which is, I'm guessing, Marina and not Philip, George.
Yeah.
This is something I've been thinking about a bit. Like, how does pop culture tell us that when you lose your virginity the wrong way, you'll be punished?
By representing bad things happening to girls who lose their virginity in the wrong way. So this is a little bit of an older example, but a classic example of this is Dawson's Creek. Joey loses her virginity in the right way. Everyone should lose their virginity on the snow trip. That's the right way.
Much better than prom. Don't go to prom yet.
But she's formed this steady, committed, romantic relationship with Pacey. They've talked about it. There's a process of negotiation. They've been together for a while. They've said, I love you. And so even though she and Pacey ultimately break up, she lost her virginity in the right way, in that she was in love, which is kind of the narrative that we tell girls now. It's not so much wait until you're married, it's wait until you are in love with it. Even if you don't stay with them forever, someone that's going to stay with you afterwards, that's going to be special to you, and the relationship is going to continue being this serious, stable, loving thing. But then we look at Jen, my mistreated queen. Actually, my third book, Ms. Rule, is dedicated to Jen Dawson's Creek because I love her so much. But she loses her virginity before the show even starts. I think at one point she says she lost her virginity when she was 12, and it's clear that she was in this like bad world of underage sex and underage drinking and probably like underage drugs and underage rock and roll and all the bad things. And it never really works out for Jen over the course of the series. She's got a few little romances with Dawson, but Dawson loves Joey. So another example of this, again from about the same time, is Buffy. Yeah, so Buffy sleeps with Angel and he immediately turns evil and tries to kill her. But I think the narrative is starting to become a little bit more complicated in contemporary pop culture. And this is kind of the thing that we see with virginity discourse, is that it's never more visible in the time than when it's beginning to disappear. So the same is true with virginity itself. You're most attentive to virginity when it's about to be lost, when it's menaced, we might say, if we're putting it in a really kind of sinister way.
I guess the show does show the good and the bad. So Daphne loses her virginity the good way.
So yeah, Marina loses it the wrong way by societal rules, even though she does say that she loved George.
Yes, correct. If we were to flip things and make Simon the virgin because he had this solemn vow and he decided to like lock it down, what could this story have looked like?
I think this could be really quite lovely, to be honest. I understand why they want to make him a rake, particularly if we look at kind of historical romance of the time. Lots of dukes, lots of rakes. What's changed? I've read a couple of scenes. I'm trying to think of a specific example, but there's quite a lot. Sometimes you see this in YA, actually, where you've got both characters are virgins and they're like, okay, neither of us really know what we're doing, but we'll work it out together.
That's really lovely. But I've also seen, like, I don't know if you've looked on YouTube and looked up like a wedding where they're like really chaste and like kiss for the first time during
and it's horrible. Yeah.
And it's the secondhand embarrassment is almost terminal.
Yeah. I think you need to have done some. I think you can't go from 0 to 100 in like a second. That's not going to end well for anyone.
That would have been the experience of women in this time, though.
Yeah. Well, not for Daphne, because would he have thus known about masturbation? Maybe this is why. Maybe he is the rake that doesn't have penetrative sex. Maybe he's really good at getting women off other ways, in which case you could have this kind of dual virgin scene. And it could have been hot, but also quite playful. And some of the power dynamics could have got like smoothed out. a little bit. And this is often a problem with not just historical romance. I think this happens in a lot of romance. People are mitigating it much, much better now, I think. But the man as teacher and the woman as student, and like there's definitely a market for that. There is an audience for that. But I have to say it's not my favorite. And when you read as many virginity loss books as I have, oh, you can overdose on that trope.
Oh, on that note, for someone who doesn't want to have babies, he sounds like he was quite the rogue.
I'm kind of interested that they didn't, I don't want to say they didn't think this through because I don't know what conversations they had in the writer's room, but if you don't want to have children and you know that penetrative sex is how you have children, surely you would get a little bit more creative. And I think this is something that Outlander did quite well, actually, is that there are quite a lot of sex scenes, but not all of them are scenes of penetrative sex. Whereas I think we've got one scene of cunnilingus in Bridgerton and the rest is all pretty speedy.
Oh, no, wait, there's two. And she's vertical both times, the stairs and the ladder.
Yeah, I forgot about the ladder. How could I forget about the ladder?
I know. It looked tricky. Degree of difficulty, high.
Yeah, and even then with the ladder, the cunnilingus is kind of the foreplay. It's not the main event. So you would think Simon would get a little bit more creative. And that might actually, really endear a lot of women to him, honestly, where they're like, I can have a good time and I definitely won't get pregnant. Like, fucking score, man.
Male virgins in historical romance, is that something that's existed for a long time? Is it something that's becoming more popular? Why? Who are the best ones? Who would you like to recommend?
It's never been a massive subgenre, but it definitely does exist. It existed a lot in kind of Victorian porn, but it would usually start off as like, oh, male virgin loses his virginity, and porn at that point was largely serialized. So the virginity loss would be like episode 1, maybe episode 2, and then he would just be fucking a different woman in every installment ever since. It's like, look, he lost his virginity and now he's the king of sex. I think there have been some really interesting interpretations of historical male virgins. Courtney Milan has done the best one, I think, in Unclaimed, the one where the hero has written a book about like how great it is to be a man virgin, and then the heroine's a courtesan, and it's a beautiful book. I think people are starting to embrace, I don't really like kind of alpha, beta, omega terminology, but particularly kind of beta heroes, cinnamon roll heroes, my favorite. We are starting to see, if not virgins, more sexually inexperienced heroes, which I think is cool.
Just to come back to the question about depictions of virginity loss in pop culture, how did Passions write themselves into the corner with the virginity loss there?
So I should note Passions, iconic 1990s 2000 soap opera. If you have not had the pleasure, it is truly like bonker balls. It is off the chain. I have been watching it lately because I love soap opera more than anything in the world. They have multiple virginity loss kind of plot lines going on, and some of them are quite traditional. So Passions is a soap by James E. Riley, who also does Days of Our Lives, who's notoriously very Catholic. So you've got quite a strong Catholic ideology informing a lot of it. So one of our textual virgins, Teresa, she's 18, she's engaged to be married. Her brother is threatening to send her to a convent like constantly. And the idea that she might sleep with her fiance Ethan before they get married is like horrifying in terms of the narrative. Like, don't do it, Teresa, you'll destroy your life. But there's another narrative which features Teresa's brother, not the one threatening to send her to a convent. That's Louise. This is her younger brother, Miguel. He's got a girlfriend called Charity. So they exist in a very different kind of plot. Ethan and Teresa is like a love triangle plot, basically standard. Miguel and Charity are in this like bonkers kind of paranormal plot. And Charity is essentially a young adult chosen one. She's a spooky witch who has premonitions. And I do not think they intended to do this because it runs so counter to the ideology of the show. But they've set up a narrative where Charity will achieve her full powers if she loses her virginity. So we're in a situation where all the wicked people are like, oh, we have to stop Charity making love to Miguel. They say make love all the time. It's very disgusting. Don't like that euphemism at all. And And so, yeah, if Charity sleeps with Miguel, if she has premarital sex, which is completely counter to the show's ideology, then she'll save the world because she'll come into her full power. It reminds me very much of, there's a kind of 2000s teen B movie, like teen slasher film called Cherry Falls, where there's a serial killer who's killing virgins, and so all the teens are trying to have sex so the serial killer won't get them. And yeah, they accidentally wrote themselves into a real Cherry Falls place when this is not what they were aiming for at all, I don't think.
And yet vastly entertaining.
Yeah, I could talk about Passions for a really long time. If anyone wants to know about Passions, please ask me. You will be sorry you asked, because I will talk for 6 hours. Adele has had to sit through a lot of me talking about Passions, but it's a great time.
Yeah, and maybe we can ask Jodie to pick her favorite like YouTube scene for Passions, and we can put it on the show notes.
Oh no, what a challenge. There are so many good ones.
Jodie's eyes just like lit up. Maybe we could get you to do a top 5. No, just one. Just one. I think we're good.
How do I choose between Hell in the Closet and the singing and the Boozeborns? And
I don't even know what you're talking about.
Yeah, Passions heads will know. They'll understand.
That's all for this bonus episode of What Would Danbury Do? Make sure you subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, because we still have a few bonus episodes up our sleeve. And of course, we'll be back soon with Bridgerton episode 6, Swish. In the meantime, you can find Dr. Jodie McAllister tweeting about pop culture, romance, and academic stuff on @JodieMacA. Or check out her books. She writes both the academic and the fiction kind. I also want to add that another Courtney Milan historical romance with a virgin hero that I love is The Heiress Effect. Robert is a duke who chooses to wait. So when his first time doesn't go so well, you kind of have to read to find out. As always, you can find us on Twitter and Facebook as @BridgertonPod and Instagram as WWDDpod. Or send us an email at bridgertonpod@gmail.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional and unceded land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people and edited by me, Rudy Bremer, on Gadigal country. Thanks for listening, and remember, WWDD. What Would Danbury Do is part of the Frolic Podcast Network. Find more podcasts you'll love at frolic.media/podcasts.